Efficiency has a body count. Welcome to Tertius Hive. In 12 hours, 17 million souls would attempt to flee through corridors built for 3 million, guided by evacuation protocols designed by men who had never seen a crowd panic. The Imperium's greatest achievement, cramming humanity into vertical coffins that scrape the sky, becomes its cruelest joke when those coffins need to empty fast. This is the story of how the machine processes people when the people refuse to be processed quietly, how imperial efficiency becomes imperial slaughter, and how 17 million heartbeats become a single statistic filed away in triplicate. To understand why it looks like this, start at the beginning. Tertius Hive rose from the ash-choked plains of Mordian Prime in M38. Its foundation stones laid over the bones of failed agricultural settlements and strip mining operations that had bled the world dry. The architects, long since recycled into corpse starch, had been tasked with housing the maximum number of bodies in the minimum footprint while maintaining optimal productivity quotas. Their solution was elegant in its brutality. Stack humans 40 kilometers high, connect them with transport arteries wide enough for cargo but narrow enough to discourage congregation, and trust that gravity would handle the rest. The original blueprints, filed in the Administratum archives beneath 17 different classification codes, reveal the true scope of the design philosophy. Residential hab blocks were calculated at 2.3 square meters per adult occupant, just enough space for a sleeping alcove, a waste receptacle, and sufficient air circulation to prevent asphyxiation during standard 8-hour rest periods. Corridors measured exactly 1.8 meters in width, determined through extensive testing to be the minimum clearance required for 2 cargo servitors to pass each other while carrying standard load pallets. Manufacturing levels occupied the hive's midsection, stretching from sub-level 30 to sub-level 120, where atmospheric processors recycled the breathable air exactly 2.7 times per standard day. Below that lay the underhive, a sprawling maze of forgotten tunnels, abandoned machinery, and human refuse that the upper levels preferred not to acknowledge. Above the manufacturing zones rose the administrative sectors, where clerks and functionaries processed the paperwork that kept 17 million people fed, housed, and productive until the moment they ceased to be useful. The evacuation routes, added as an afterthought during the Hive's second century of operation, followed the existing cargo arteries with minimal modification. Emergency planners had calculated that in the event of catastrophic threat, the Hive could be evacuated in stages over a period of 6 standard days, with Priority Alpha personnel evacuated first, followed by essential workers, and concluding with general population removal as circumstances permit. The calculations assumed rational behavior, orderly queue formation, and sufficient advance warning to implement staged evacuation protocols. They did not account for 17 million people receiving simultaneous notification that they had 12 hours to live. For 3 millennia, the system worked within acceptable parameters. Workers descended to their shifts in the manufactorums, following prescribed routes at prescribed times, carrying prescribed tools to perform prescribed tasks. Product ascended to the loading docks via automated cargo lifts that operated on strict schedules, monitored by cogitator systems that tracked every pallet, every container, every bolt shell and lasgun power pack from production line to transport ship. Waste heat and recycled air kept the population docile enough to reproduce and die on schedule, maintaining what imperial planners called thermal equilibrium, a steady state where births barely exceeded deaths, keeping population density within acceptable parameters for social control. The Hive had achieved something approaching perfection in its own limited way. Crime rates remained manageable through strategic application of summary execution. Productivity quotas were met or exceeded in 97.3% of reporting periods. Food riots occurred on a predictable schedule that allowed security forces to deploy in advance and contain unrest to designated areas where it could burn itself out without disrupting critical infrastructure. Even rebellion, when it occurred, followed patterns that the system could absorb and process. Cult activity was detected, tracked, and eliminated through established protocols. Labor unrest was channeled into sanctioned protests that provided emotional release while changing nothing substantial. Political dissent was managed through careful distribution of privileged positions and strategic reassignment of potential troublemakers to positions where their skills could be utilized without their influence spreading. The machine had learned to consume its own dysfunction and convert it into stability. This was the Imperium's greatest triumph, the creation of a system so comprehensive, so total, that even resistance served its purposes. Then, why? Scarjaw reached the outer defense grid, and equilibrium became a memory. Names matter here, because each name decides a fate. The Imperial Emergency Evacuation Codex recognizes 17 distinct categories of civilian during crisis relocation, each with specific movement priorities, designated routes, and acceptable casualty percentages. Priority Alpha covers planetary governors, sector command staff, and anyone whose gene seed or genetic template cannot be replaced within a standard year. These individuals receive immediate transport to orbit via personal shuttlecraft, bypassing the evacuation system entirely. Their survival rate approaches 98.7%, with losses attributed primarily to enemy action rather than system inefficiency. Priority Beta includes skilled artisans, tech adepts, munitions workers, and specialized personnel whose replacement requires more than 6 months of training. They evacuate via dedicated transport corridors with enhanced structural integrity and supplemental life support systems. Medical stations along beta routes stock combat stimulants, rad counters, and emergency surgery equipment operated by fully trained Medicus staff. Their survival rate averages 94.2%. with most casualties occurring during transport to orbital facilities rather than during the evacuation itself. Priority Gamma encompasses general manufacturing labor, agricultural workers, household servants, and citizens deemed functionally essential to immediate war production needs. Their evacuation routes follow standard cargo arteries with minimal modification, equipped with basic medical stations and staffed by volunteer medics with 6 weeks of trauma training. They receive standard ration packs and water allocation for a 72-hour evacuation period. Their survival rate fluctuates between 67.8% and 82.4%, depending on crisis severity and availability of transport assets. Priority Delta covers non-essential civilian population, including retired workers, dependents of essential personnel, and citizens with specialized skills that may prove useful during reconstruction efforts. Their evacuation routes overlap with Gamma corridors, but receive lower priority for medical resources and transport allocation. Food and water supplies are distributed on a needs basis determined by local commanders. Their survival rate ranges from 43.1% to 78.9%, with wide variation based on local conditions and resource availability. Everyone else receives Priority Omega. The Codex does not specify evacuation procedures for Priority Omega civilians. It doesn't need to. Within priority classifications exist sub-designations that determine survival probability down to the decimal point. Medical Omega-7s are elderly or chronically ill individuals whose caloric requirements exceed their productive output. The Codex recommends comfort measures and spiritual counseling for this population, with evacuation contingent on available resources after higher priority populations have been secured. Dependency Omega-12s include children under 8 standard years who cannot traverse evacuation routes without assistance. Their survival depends entirely on the presence of adult supervisors willing to sacrifice their own evacuation prospects to provide care. Geographic Omega-15As live in Hive sections where structural integrity cannot guarantee safe passage during emergency decompression. These areas include the under-Hive tunnels, outer rim hab blocks, and manufacturing sectors where toxic atmosphere or unstable architecture makes evacuation more dangerous than remaining in place. Citizens in these areas receive evacuation instructions but no guarantee of route viability or destination security. Behavioral Omega-18s have been flagged for non-compliance with evacuation protocols based on previous drill performance, psychological evaluations, or criminal records. They receive evacuation notices but are assigned to routes with minimal supervision and support. The assumption is that individuals who cannot follow instructions during practice will endanger others during actual emergency, making their exclusion a form of population quality control. Each category has its own colored transit pass, its own designated assembly area, its own projected survival rate filed away in actuarial reports that no one expects to read. The passes are printed on dissolvable biopaper that breaks down after 72 hours, ensuring that priority assignments cannot be forged or transferred once the evacuation begins. The biopaper also contains genetic markers that can be read by automated scanners, preventing citizens from claiming higher priority status through document theft or forgery. But all the colored papers in the galaxy mean nothing when 17 million people hear the same air raid klaxon at the same time. The sound begins as a low mechanical whine, building gradually until it reaches the frequency that resonates in human bone marrow, the pitch that triggers flight response at the cellular level. It echoes through every corridor, every hab block, every workspace in the Hive, amplified by acoustic systems designed to penetrate industrial noise and override human conversation. For 60 seconds, the klaxon dominates all other sound, ensuring that no citizen can claim ignorance of the emergency status. Then comes Governor Maltheus's voice, broadcast simultaneously through every voxcaster, every data slate, every public address system in the Hive. His words have been carefully scripted by Departamento Munitorum advisors to project confidence while conveying urgency. Citizens of Tertius Hive, by order of the Imperial Guard High Command, immediate evacuation procedures are now in effect. Proceed to your designated assembly areas in accordance with your priority classifications. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance is treason. The Emperor protects. The message repeats every 30 seconds for the next 11 hours and 13 minutes. It will be the last thing many citizens hear. But before the governor's voice fades, before the evacuation begins in earnest, there is a moment of perfect silence when 17 million people simultaneously process the same information and reach the same conclusion. They have 12 hours to live unless they can reach safety. And safety lies at the end of corridors designed to kill them. On the ground, it reduces to a timetable and a heartbeat. Shift change in sub-level 94 happens at 0600 hours Imperial Standard, a ritual as precise and predictable as the movement of planetary bodies. The manufactorum workers flood the main transit arteries just as the overnight cleaning crews finish their rounds and head home to their hab blocks. Morning shift supervisors arrive early to review production quotas, carrying data slates loaded with efficiency reports and quality control metrics. Late shift workers linger in the communal areas, sharing ration packs and trading rumors about orc movements in the outer system. Under normal circumstances, this creates manageable congestion. The transit arteries can handle the flow because people move with purpose and destination. Workers know their routes because they have walked them every day for years, decades, entire lifetimes spent following the same paths from hab block to workspace and back again. Supervisors know their schedules because the schedules never change, locked into optimal efficiency patterns by generations of time-motion studies and productivity analysis. Even the cleaning crews follow predictable patterns, pushing their waste carts through service corridors that run parallel to the main thoroughfares, invisible to the workers whose waste they collect and process. The system works because it eliminates choice. Citizens do not decide where to go or when to go there. They follow the paths laid out for them by minds that see the Hive as a single organism with 17 million component parts. Each part has its function, its place, its time to move, and its time to be still. The beauty of the system lies in its predictability, its resistance to human whim and individual decision-making. But when the evacuation sirens wail, purpose transforms into panic. Destination becomes anywhere but here. The same corridors that funnel workers to their assigned duties become killing fields where human bodies compress into human paste, where the machine's greatest strength, its ability to process vast numbers of people efficiently, becomes its greatest weakness when those people refuse to be processed quietly. Marta Helsing had been reviewing overnight production reports when the siren started, sitting in her cramped supervisory alcove overlooking Assembly Line 7, where workers assembled bolt shells in 12-hour shifts that would continue until the moment the hive fell, or they did. She had been noting the 17% increase in production efficiency achieved through implementation of new quota incentives, extra water rations for workers who exceeded daily targets, reduced break periods for those who fell behind. The numbers pleased her because they pleased her supervisors, and pleasing supervisors was the key to maintaining priority gamma status in a world where priority omega meant death. The first klaxon blast had made her look up from her data slate, frowning at the interruption to her concentration. Emergency drills were scheduled for the third Tuesday of each month, and this was Thursday. False alarms occurred occasionally due to equipment malfunction or overzealous security personnel, but they were always followed immediately by an all-clear signal and a stern announcement about the importance of maintaining work schedules. The second blast made her stomach clench. The third made her reach for her emergency kit, a small bag containing her identification documents, 3 days' worth of water purification tablets, and a single Laspistol power pack that she was licensed to carry as a production supervisor. By the time Governor Malthius's voice echoed through the alcove, she was already moving toward the exit, her priority gamma transit pass clutched in her left hand like a holy relic. The faded green biopaper felt fragile between her fingers, its genetic markers invisible to the naked eye, but essential for passage through the automated checkpoints that controlled access to evacuation routes. She had earned this pass through 15 years of service, working her way up from assembly line grunt to shift supervisor through a combination of competence, obedience, and willingness to report fellow workers who violated productivity standards. The pass represented everything she had achieved in her 43 years of life, the right to live slightly longer than the people beneath her in the hierarchy. Now she stands trapped in Transit Corridor C7, her feet barely touching the deck plating as the crowd lifts and carries her forward. The corridor stretches ahead for 3 kilometers, a straight line that connects sublevel 94 to the evacuation lifts. But she can see only the back of the head belonging to Yorick, a hydraulic press operator whose priority gamma pass had been yellow an hour ago and is now soaked brown with someone else's blood. Yorick had been a decent worker, not exceptional, but reliable enough to maintain his classification and avoid the productivity reviews that could result in reclassification to Priority Delta or worse. He had operated Hydraulic Press Unit 7 for 12 years, stamping armor plating for Chimera personnel carriers at a rate of 847 pieces per standard shift. His work had protected thousands of Imperial Guard soldiers across dozens of war zones, each piece of armor bearing his press stamp and production number. Now his blood marks someone else's evacuation pass, and Marta wonders if the armor he stamped is protecting the soldiers who failed to protect them. Behind her, she can hear crying. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, calling for his mother in the high, piercing voice that cuts through the rumble of 10,000 shuffling feet. The voice carries the particular note of terror that children produce when they realize that adults cannot protect them, that the safety they have always taken for granted was an illusion maintained by people who are just as afraid as they are. She wants to turn around, wants to help, but her arms are pinned to her sides by the press of bodies, and turning would mean losing her footing, and losing her footing would mean disappearing beneath the crowd to emerge somewhere else as something that used to be human. The mathematics of survival are brutally simple. Every movement she makes to help someone else is a movement that reduces her own chances of reaching the evacuation lifts alive. The child's voice gets fainter as the crowd carries her forward, away from whoever needs help, toward the promise of safety that lies 3 kilometers ahead if she can survive long enough to reach it. Then it stops, not with a final scream or sob, but with a sudden silence that means a small body has been compressed beyond the point where lungs can expand and vocal cords can vibrate. Marta counts her heartbeats and thinks about the bolt shells her line produces, 17 rounds per minute per worker, each one stamped with a purity seal and a production number that traces back to her supervisory code. She wonders if any of those bolts will fire today, if they will punch through orc armor or Imperial flesh, if it matters. The crowd carries her forward, and she stops thinking about anything at all except the rhythm of feet and heartbeat, the steady pressure against her ribs, the need to keep breathing one breath at a time until breathing becomes impossible. The evacuation announcement comes at 0647 hours, but by then the corridors are already full. Word had spread through the Hive's informal communication networks, the whispered conversations in break areas, the coded messages passed between work shifts, the rumors that travel faster than official announcements because fear moves at the speed of human speech, while bureaucracy moves at the speed of paperwork processing. The workers in sub-level 94 had known something was wrong before the klaxons sounded. Production quotas had been increased by 30% overnight. Security patrols had doubled their frequency. Most telling of all, the lift schedules had been modified to prioritize cargo evacuation over personnel transport, a change that could only mean one thing. The Hive was being abandoned, and the evacuation would prioritize material assets over human resources. So when the sirens finally wailed, the corridors were already crowded with people who had made the calculation that survival meant moving before they were told to move, that waiting for official permission was the same as waiting to die. After the smoke clears, the rules return. The Imperial Emergency. Evacuation Codex runs to 14,000 pages of protocols, contingencies, and acceptable loss calculations, contained in 17 volumes that are updated annually by committees of experts who have never participated in an actual evacuation. Section 7 Sand A mandates that all evacuation routes be clearly marked with directions to assembly areas. Section 7E-B requires that these routes be tested monthly with mandatory civilian drills. Section 7A-C specifies that drill participation is recorded and that citizens who fail to attend mandatory drills are reclassified to lower priority status. In practice, the evacuation routes are marked with signs painted in high Gothic script that most citizens cannot read, tested with drills that evacuate only the upper Hive levels where priority classifications tend to run alpha through beta, and recorded by clerks who rarely venture below sub-level 50. The monthly drills involve moving approximately 3,000 volunteers through abbreviated route sections during off-peak hours, while 17 million citizens continue their normal work schedules and receive their emergency preparedness training through informational pamphlets distributed with their monthly ration allowances. The pamphlets, printed on the same bio paper as evacuation passes, contain detailed instructions for proper evacuation behavior. Maintain calm deportment, follow designated routes, obey all instructions from evacuation personnel, report suspicious activity or non-compliance to the nearest authority figure. They do not contain maps of the evacuation routes, locations of assembly areas, or any information that might actually prove useful during an emergency. Such information is classified above the clearance level of priority Omega civilians and is available only to personnel with need-to-know authorization. The assembly areas themselves follow strict Imperial specifications, 40 square meters per 1,000 evacuees, with sufficient structural integrity to withstand indirect artillery bombardment, ventilation systems rated for triple normal occupancy, and medical facilities equipped to treat standard evacuation injuries, including crowd crush, smoke inhalation, and psychological trauma. The specifications are based on extensive research conducted by the Departamento Munitorum using data collected from 17 previous Hive evacuations across 12 different sectors. Assembly Area 94C measures 37 square meters and was designed to hold 800 evacuees from sub-level 94. The 3 square meter shortfall was attributed to architectural limitations in the original Hive design and was deemed acceptable based on calculations showing that crowd compression would reduce individual space requirements through natural settling processes. When the evacuation begins, Assembly Area 94C holds nearly 6,000 people, packed so tightly that children disappear completely beneath the crowd and emerge only when someone falls and creates momentary space above them. The structural integrity holds, proving the wisdom of Imperial engineering standards. The ventilation system continues to function. circulating air that tastes increasingly of human fear and human waste. But the medical facilities prove inadequate within the first hour. The medical facilities consist of a single autosurgeon unit and a storage closet containing 300 doses of generic pain suppressants. The autosurgeon, a marvel of 30th millennium medical technology, can diagnose and treat 47 different categories of trauma injury using a combination of mechanical precision and limited artificial intelligence. It was programmed with treatment protocols optimized for battlefield conditions, where speed matters more than comfort, and patient survival takes priority over patient comfort. The autosurgeon runs out of anesthetic after the first hour and switches to amputation protocols after the second. Its programming prioritizes saving lives over saving limbs, removing damaged tissue that might cause infection or blood loss without regard for the patient's future quality of life. By the third hour, it has shut down entirely, its blood-clogged sensors unable to distinguish between patients and corpses, its mechanical arms frozen in position over what used to be someone's daughter. But the rules matter less than the men who enforce them. The Evacuation Enforcement Corps consists of Astra Militarum veterans deemed unfit for frontline service due to injury, age, or psychological trauma. They are the walking wounded of the Imperium's endless wars. Men and women who have given their best years to the war effort and received in return the privilege of dying slowly instead of quickly, of serving the Emperor in diminished capacity rather than serving him in death. They receive 6 weeks of crowd control training focused on theoretical crowd dynamics and practical application of violence. The training manual, written in Low Gothic for accessibility, contains detailed diagrams showing proper riot suppression techniques, optimal positioning for crowd control operations, and acceptable casualty ratios for different types of civil disturbance. The manual does not address evacuation scenarios involving 17 million panicked civilians, because such scenarios are considered beyond normal operational parameters. Each Enforcement Corps member receives a las pistol with 3 charge packs, a riot suppression baton, and a Vox unit for communication with command authority. They are authorized to use lethal force to maintain order, prevent panic, and ensure compliance with evacuation protocols. Their standing orders are simple: keep the crowds moving, prevent bottlenecks, and maintain priority classification integrity by preventing lower priority civilians from accessing higher priority evacuation routes. Their job is to maintain order during civilian evacuation. Their tools are volume of fire and the Emperor's authority. Their enemy is 17 million panicked humans in a space built for 3 million calm ones. Sergeant Corvain stands at the entrance to Transit Corridor C7, his last pistol drawn but not yet firing, watching the crowd compress itself into a solid mass of flesh and bone and terror. He has been a soldier for 27 years, has seen men die in every possible way the galaxy can devise, has pulled the trigger until the last pack ran dry, and then pulled it some more because sometimes the Emperor demands everything, and sometimes everything is not enough. He had lost his left leg below the knee to an orc choppa on Armageddon, his right eye to shrapnel from a chaos artillery barrage on Cadia, and his peace of mind to things that had no names and left no wounds that medical scanners could detect. The Evacuation Enforcement Corps had been his reward for 27 years of faithful service. A chance to serve the Emperor while sitting down, a posting where the worst danger was paperwork and the greatest challenge was staying awake during mandatory efficiency briefings. But this is different. This is not war, where death has meaning and purpose and serves the greater glory of the Imperium. This is logistics failing at scale, and logistics failure kills more efficiently than any weapon ever forged because it kills without malice, without intention, without even awareness that killing is occurring. His Vox unit crackles with status reports from other evacuation points throughout the Hive. The reports follow standard military format, brief and factual, designed to convey essential information without emotional content that might interfere with command decision-making. Corridor B3 reports acceptable flow rates with only minor casualties. Corridor D9 reports complete blockage and requests immediate medical support. Assembly Area 78A reports reaching capacity and requests permission to deny entry to priority Omega civilians. Corridor F2 reports structural damage to evacuation route. Recommend rerouting through alternate passages. Assembly Area 45B reports critical overcrowding. Auto surgeon offline, requesting priority medical resupply. Corridor H7 reports civilian riot suppression in progress. Estimate 30 to 40 casualties. Situation contained. Corvain keys his Vox and reports what he sees. A wall of human beings pressed against each other so tightly that some have stopped breathing not from injury, but from simple mechanical compression, their ribs unable to expand against the weight of their neighbors. Their faces turning blue, while their feet continue walking forward because the crowd allows no other direction of movement. Command, this is Checkpoint C7, observing critical crowd density in main transit corridor. Estimate 10,000 civilians in space, rated for 3,000. Mechanical asphyxiation occurring. Request permission to implement crowd reduction protocols. The response comes back within seconds, delivered in the same emotionless tone that conveys all official Imperial communications. Checkpoint C7. Maintain order. Ensure proper priority classification enforcement. Acceptable casualty rates are within established parameters. Continue mission. Corvain looks at his last pistol, then at the crowd, then at the last pistol again. He has 3 charge packs. Each pack contains enough energy for 60 shots. The crowd contains approximately 10,000 people in his line of sight alone, with more arriving every minute as the evacuation continues. The math is simple. His weapon will fire 180 shots before running dry. Even if every shot killed instantly, even if every shot hit its target, even if he could fire without pause for reloading, he could reduce the crowd density by less than 2% before becoming helpless to influence the situation further. The decision is not simple. His orders are to maintain order, but order has already failed. His mission is to ensure priority classification enforcement, but the crowd has moved beyond any possibility of classification checking. His purpose is to serve the Emperor, but the Emperor's servants are trampling each other to death while he watches from a position where intervention would be both futile and suicidal. So he stands and watches and reports what he sees, because sometimes service means bearing witness to failure, and sometimes the only way to serve the Emperor is to accurately document the cost of serving him. A few things still work, though none are kind. The evacuation lifts, massively over-engineered by Adeptus Mechanicus standards, can carry their full rated loads every 47 seconds without mechanical failure. Each lift can transport 300 people at a time through the 40-kilometer vertical distance between sub-level 94 and the surface evacuation points. The lift systems were designed with triple redundancy and self-repairing mechanisms that can continue operation even under combat conditions. The mathematics are encouraging. With 12 operational lifts serving sub-level 94, the theoretical evacuation capacity is 230,000 people per hour, meaning the entire sub-level population could be evacuated in under 4 hours if optimal loading conditions could be maintained. But optimal loading conditions assume orderly queues, proper spacing between evacuees, and sufficient time for loading and unloading procedures. In practice, each lift departure is a small-scale catastrophe as hundreds of people attempt to force themselves into spaces designed for dozens, creating compression injuries and mechanical failures that reduce both capacity and cycle time. The Vox network, powered by redundant geothermal cells, maintains communication between all evacuation zones, even as individual sections lose power. The network was designed to survive orbital bombardment, electromagnetic warfare, and complete infrastructure collapse, making it one of the most reliable systems in the Hive. Communications flow smoothly between command centers, evacuation checkpoints, and individual enforcement personnel, ensuring that situation reports reach decision-makers in real time. But the efficiency of communication only highlights the inefficiency of everything else. Command knows exactly how many people are dying and where they are dying and how quickly they are dying. But command cannot alter the fundamental mathematics of moving 17 million people through spaces designed for 3 million. The network carries a constant stream of requests for medical support, additional personnel, route modifications, and priority overrides, all of which are acknowledged, processed, and filed according to proper procedure, while changing nothing about the reality on the ground. The medical stations, understaffed and undersupplied, continue to process trauma cases according to strict triage protocols that prioritize victims most likely to survive over those most in need of help. The protocols were developed through extensive battlefield experience and refined through statistical analysis of treatment outcomes across thousands of combat scenarios. Priority 1 cases receive immediate intervention. Patients with traumatic injuries who will die without treatment but who have excellent prospects for full recovery with proper care. Priority 2 cases receive delayed treatment. Patients with serious injuries who will probably survive without immediate intervention and who have good prospects for recovery with eventual care. Priority 3 cases receive comfort measures only. Patients with injuries so severe that death is inevitable regardless of treatment, for whom medical resources would be wasted. The system works efficiently in battlefield conditions where medical resources are limited and patient volume is manageable. It fails catastrophically when patient volume exceeds resource capacity by several orders of magnitude, creating situations where Priority 1 cases become Priority 3 cases while waiting for treatment, and Priority 3 cases die while Priority 2 cases wait for Priority 1 cases to clear the treatment queue. But the most effective evacuation tool is also the cruelest: hunger. After the first 6 hours, dehydration begins to reduce crowd density through simple biological failure. The human body can survive approximately 3 days without water under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions do not include standing upright in a compressed crowd while breathing recycled air and experiencing extreme stress. After 8 hours, the weakest evacuees collapse and are trampled, creating temporary space for the survivors to advance. The collapsed bodies do not disappear. They are compressed into the deck plating by the weight of thousands of feet, creating a biological foundation that allows the crowd to flow over what used to be fellow citizens. After 10 hours, enough people have died that movement through the transit corridors becomes possible again. The crowd has literally consumed itself, processing its own weakest members into passable terrain. This is not planned, not intended, not desired by anyone involved in the evacuation effort. But it works, and working solutions are implemented regardless of their moral implications. The Departamento Munitorum has calculated these casualty curves with actuarial precision. The official designation is natural population reduction via environmental stressing, a technical term for letting people die of exposure while trapped in evacuation queues. The calculations take into account age demographics, health statistics, caloric reserves, and psychological stress factors to predict when crowd density will reach optimal levels for evacuation continuation. It works because human beings are machines, and machines fail when operated beyond their design parameters. Crowd density beyond optimal capacity creates mechanical stress that propagates through the human system until structural failure occurs at the weakest points. The failure points are predictable: respiratory failure when rib compression prevents lung expansion, circulatory failure when vascular compression reduces blood flow, neurological failure when panic response overrides rational decision-making. The Corps of Engineers has documented these failure modes extensively through post-evacuation analysis of previous operations. Their reports recommend acceptable loss management through strategic bottleneck creation, priority-based queue separation, and systematic load reduction via environmental factors. The recommendations are based on engineering principles rather than humanitarian considerations, treating human crowd dynamics as a fluid mechanics problem rather than a moral challenge. They do not recommend improving evacuation infrastructure. Infrastructure improvements require resources that could be allocated to weapons production, and weapons kill the enemy more efficiently than corridors save civilians. The engineers' cost-benefit analysis shows that the resources required to upgrade evacuation capacity throughout the Imperium would equal the resources required to build approximately 40,000 additional Lehman Russ battle tanks or 150,000 las cannon batteries. The choice is simple: save civilians or kill enemies. The Imperium chooses to kill enemies because dead enemies cannot threaten future civilians, while saved civilians may produce future enemies if they are not properly controlled. The enemy always gets a vote, and the enemy votes for maximum Imperial casualties through any means available. What few evacuation manuals mention, what no amount of drill preparation can simulate, is the moment when civilization collapses at the cellular level. It is not a dramatic moment marked by explosions or proclamations or final speeches. It is a quiet moment when individual human beings stop seeing other human beings as people and start seeing them as obstacles to survival, as resources to be consumed, as problems to be solved through violence. It happens when Marta Helsing, still clutching her green transit pass, watches Yorick disappear beneath the crowd and realizes that the brown stains on his pass were not someone else's blood, but his own, leaking from internal injuries caused by the simple pressure of too many bodies in too small a space. She realizes that she is relieved to see him fall because his collapse creates momentary space around her, room to breathe and move and continue her own struggle toward survival. It happens when Sergeant Corvain stops counting the dead and starts counting the spaces they leave behind, measuring progress in corpses per square meter rather than lives saved or civilians evacuated. He realizes that he is rooting for the crowd to fail faster, to consume itself more efficiently, so that his reports will show improving evacuation flow rates rather than continuing catastrophic failure. It happens when the child whose crying had cut through the crowd noise stops crying not because his mother found him, but because he has stopped breathing, crushed by the very people trying to save themselves. And the people around him realize they are grateful for the silence because the crying had been making them think about their own children, their own mortality, their own inability to help anyone, including themselves. The evacuation protocols do not account for this moment because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that the Imperium's greatest strength, its ability to process vast numbers of human beings as resources rather than individuals, becomes its greatest weakness when those resources begin processing each other according to the same ruthless logic. But the moment matters, because it is the moment when the machine stops pretending to be anything other than what it has always been, a device for consuming human life and converting it into something useful for the war effort. The evacuation is not designed to save people. It is designed to sort people into categories of usefulness and dispose of the useless categories in the most efficient manner possible. The useful people, priority Alpha through Gamma, reach the evacuation lifts and ascend to orbital transport. The useless people, priority Delta through Omega, become fertilizer for the next generation of useful people. This is not failure. This is success, measured by the metrics that actually matter to the system's designers. The evacuation continues for 11 hours and 13 minutes. When the all-clear sounds, 14,400,000 citizens have successfully relocated to designated safe zones in the outer Hive sections and orbital transport facilities. 800,000 citizens are confirmed dead, their bodies identified through genetic scanning of remains and cross-referenced with evacuation pass databases. 1,700,000 citizens are unaccounted for, their transit passes found scattered throughout the evacuation routes with no corresponding bodies. The missing are classified as processing anomalies and officially presumed dead. Their ration allocations are redistributed to refugee populations. Their HAB block assignments are transferred to new arrivals from off-world. Their work shifts are filled by replacement labor drawn from the refugee camps that spring up around every major Imperial operation. The machinery of bureaucracy processes their absence as efficiently as it had processed their presence, updating databases and adjusting resource allocation calculations to account for the reduced population load. Death in the Imperial system is simply another form of reassignment. The Imperial Guard reports the evacuation as a qualified success with acceptable casualty rates well within established parameters. The official report, filed in triplicate and distributed to 17 different Imperial departments, notes that evacuation efficiency exceeded theoretical projections by 12%, largely due to natural population reduction occurring ahead of schedule. The report commends the Evacuation Enforcement Corps for their stalwart service in the face of overwhelming logistical challenges, and recommends that current evacuation protocols be maintained for future operations. Governor Maltheus himself signs the commendation orders. his signature authorizing posthumous recognition for Enforcement Corps members who died maintaining order during the evacuation. The commendations note that these individuals gave their lives in service to the Emperor's divine will and exemplified the highest standards of imperial service through their selfless sacrifice. The families of the deceased receive notification of their loved one's heroism, along with standard death benefits and reassignment to Priority Delta housing in recognition of their loss. The Departamento Munitorum files a separate report analyzing evacuation metrics and identifying areas for improvement in future operations. The report recommends increasing Enforcement Corps staffing levels by 15%, upgrading medical equipment in assembly areas, and implementing enhanced crowd reduction protocols to improve evacuation flow rates. The recommendations are forwarded to the appropriate committees for review and implementation consideration. No one mentions that the orc attack never came. Wah! Scarjaw had been diverted to a neighboring system 3 hours before the evacuation began, pursuing a more attractive target where Imperial defenses appeared weaker and potential loot more plentiful. The diversion order had been transmitted via astropathic communication to Tertius Hive Command, but the message never reached Governor Maltheus due to a clerical error in the communication processing center. Astropath Valdris, a 73-year-old psyker whose decades of faithful service had earned him a comfortable position in the Hive's communication hub, had received the message clearly and transcribed it accurately. But the transcription had been filed under the wrong classification code, Priority 7 instead of Priority 1, causing it to enter the administrative processing queue rather than being delivered immediately to command authority. By the time the filing error was discovered, the evacuation was already in progress and could not be safely halted without creating additional casualties. The decision was made to continue the evacuation rather than risk the chaos that would result from attempting to reverse 17 million people in mid-evacuation. The all-clear signal was delayed until evacuation completion to maintain operational security and prevent intelligence leaks that might compromise future defensive operations. 1,700,000 people died because a clerk on a data slate classified an urgent message as routine correspondence. Their names are not recorded in any memorial because their deaths were not officially combat casualties. Their sacrifice is not honored in any ceremony because their sacrifice was not planned or intentional. Their bodies are not buried in any cemetery because their bodies were processed through the Hive's standard waste reclamation systems to maintain sanitary conditions in the evacuation zones. But their deaths serve the Emperor's purpose, because every death in service to the Imperium teaches the survivors what service truly means: absolute obedience to the machine, regardless of whether the machine serves any purpose beyond its own continuation. The evacuation demonstrated that Imperial citizens will follow orders even when those orders lead to their destruction, that the system can process any amount of human suffering without breaking down. That loyalty to the Emperor transcends individual survival instinct. This lesson is more valuable than the lives lost learning it, because it reinforces the psychological foundations upon which the Imperium rests. Fear of death keeps citizens obedient, but proof that the system will sacrifice anyone for any reason keeps them utterly compliant. The evacuation was not a failure of planning or execution. It was a demonstration of Imperial power at its most fundamental level. The psychological impact of the evacuation extends far beyond the immediate casualties. Survivors carry the knowledge that they lived because others died, that their Priority Gamma passes were purchased with Priority Omega blood, that their continued existence depends on their continued usefulness to a system that views them as expendable resources. This knowledge makes them more productive, more compliant, more willing to accept whatever conditions the system imposes because they have seen what happens to people who are not useful enough to save. The evacuation becomes a teaching tool, a reminder that is referenced in productivity meetings and efficiency briefings throughout the Hive. When workers complain about working conditions, supervisors remind them of the citizens who died in the corridors. When citizens question resource allocation, administrators point to the evacuation as proof that the system prioritizes the most valuable individuals for protection. When anyone suggests that the Imperium should value human life more highly, They are asked whether they would prefer to be priority Omega rather than their current classification. The threat is implicit but clear. Continued classification depends on continued compliance, and reclassification to priority Omega is always possible for citizens who forget their place in the hierarchy. 6 months after the evacuation, the Hive's population has returned to optimal levels through immigration from neighboring systems and increased birth rates among priority Alpha and Beta citizens. The new arrivals are assigned to hab blocks that were vacated during the evacuation, taking over the living spaces and work assignments of the dead as if those people had never existed. The efficiency reports show improved productivity per capita, attributed to the psychological effect of the evacuation on worker motivation. The evacuation routes are returned to their normal function as cargo arteries and pedestrian corridors. The assembly areas are converted back to storage facilities and maintenance workshops. The emergency medical equipment is redistributed to other facilities throughout the Imperium, where it might prove useful during future crisis situations. But the evacuation sirens remain in place, ready to sound again when the next crisis arrives. The Evacuation Enforcement Corps maintains its staffing levels and continues its training programs. The priority classification system continues to sort citizens into categories of usefulness. The machine maintains its readiness to process human suffering whenever processing becomes necessary, because there will be a next time. The galaxy is a hostile place where crises emerge without warning and Imperial responses must be swift and decisive. The evacuation demonstrated that the system works, that it can handle any challenge through proper application of Imperial principles. The casualties were regrettable but acceptable. The efficiency was commendable, and the lessons learned will improve future operations. The next evacuation will be more efficient because the system learned from this one. More people will survive because the weak have been removed from the population. The process will be smoother because the survivors know what to expect. The casualties will be more acceptable because they will be better planned. This is how the Imperium improves. Through the systematic application of failure analysis to human resource management, through the conversion of tragedy into efficiency metrics, through the transformation of individual suffering into collective strength. Step back far enough and the pattern refuses to blink. The Imperium builds Hive cities not because they house humanity efficiently, but because they process humanity efficiently. The difference matters only to the people being processed. Everyone else, the governors and the generals, the clerks and the cogitators, the architects and the actuaries, sees only the numbers, and the numbers always balance. 17 million people entered the evacuation system. 14.4 million people exited it alive. The difference, 2.6 million human beings, represents an acceptable loss rate of 15.29%, well within the parameters established by the Imperial Evacuation Efficiency Standards. The system worked exactly as designed, producing the expected results through the application of proven methodologies. The evacuation was not a disaster. It was a successful demonstration of Imperial administrative capability under crisis conditions. The casualties were not victims. They were acceptable losses incurred during a necessary resource reallocation. The survivors were not lucky. They were the natural result of proper priority classification and efficient resource management. This is what success looks like when success is measured by the survival of the system rather than the survival of the individuals within it. This is what efficiency means when efficiency prioritizes process over people, outcomes over intentions, results over methods. The machine worked. The machine always works. The machine is designed to work regardless of how much human suffering is required to make it work. Tertius Hive continues to function at optimal capacity. Production quotas are met or exceeded in 98.1% of reporting periods, an improvement over pre-evacuation performance levels. Crime rates have decreased by 23% due to the removal of problematic population elements during the evacuation. Birth rates among priority Alpha and Beta citizens have increased by 7%, ensuring that the Hive's genetic quality continues to improve over time. The Hive has become more efficient through the evacuation process, not despite it. The loss of 2.6 million citizens eliminated the least productive members of the population, while demonstrating to the survivors the importance of maintaining their own productivity levels. The psychological impact has been overwhelmingly positive from an administrative perspective, creating a more compliant and motivated workforce. The evacuation is studied in imperial military academies as an example of successful crisis management under adverse conditions. The casualty rates are compared favorably to historical precedents from other Hive cities, other worlds, other crises where imperial efficiency was tested and proven. The lessons learned are incorporated into updated evacuation protocols that will be implemented throughout the sector. Future evacuations will benefit from the experience gained at Tertius Hive. The acceptable casualty percentages have been refined based on actual performance data rather than theoretical projections. The crowd management techniques have been validated through practical application. The priority classification system has been proven effective at sorting populations according to their value to the imperial war effort. The system learns. The system adapts. The system improves through the systematic application of human suffering to administrative challenges. But the system never questions whether improvement is worth the cost, because the cost is always paid by someone else. The administrators who design evacuation protocols will never be priority omega. The generals who approve casualty rates will never stand in the crushing corridors. The bureaucrats who classify citizens according to their usefulness will always be useful enough to classify others. This separation is not accidental. It is essential to the system's function. If the people who make decisions about acceptable casualties were themselves subject to becoming acceptable casualties, the system would prioritize different outcomes. If the architects of efficiency were themselves subject to being processed by their own machinery, they would design different machines. But they are not, and so they do not, and the machine continues to consume human life and convert it into statistical abstractions that justify consuming more human life in the future. There is only the machine, and the machine needs what it needs. It needs bodies to fill the manufactorums and minds to operate the equipment and hearts to beat fast enough to meet production quotas. It needs fear to maintain compliance and hope to prevent despair and faith to justify suffering. It needs enemies to fight and citizens to sacrifice and victories to celebrate regardless of their cost. Most of all, it needs people who believe that the machine serves them rather than the other way around, that the suffering is temporary and the victory is permanent, that the casualties are acceptable because the alternative is worse. The evacuation sirens will sound again tomorrow, in another hive, on another world, for another crisis that may or may not exist. And the machine will process another 17 million souls, convert them into another 14.4 million productive citizens, and file another report noting that efficiency improvements remain possible through better natural population reduction techniques. The clerks will file the paperwork. The administrators will review the statistics. The generals will approve the casualty rates. The system will learn and adapt and improve its ability to process human suffering into imperial strength. And somewhere in the depths of another hive, another Marta Helsing will clutch another colored pass and count another heartbeat and wonder if any of it matters while the crowd carries her toward another evacuation lift that may or may not have room for one more acceptable casualty. This is what service looks like when the service is to something that no longer remembers why it was worth serving in the first place. This is what happens when the means become the end, when the tool becomes the master, when the machine achieves perfection by measuring only what it was designed to measure and ignoring everything else that matters. This is what happens when efficiency becomes an end in itself, divorced from any consideration of what is being made efficient, or why efficiency matters, or whether the things being optimized should exist at all. The Imperium has achieved perfect efficiency in the processing of human suffering. Every death serves a purpose. Every casualty teaches a lesson. Every tragedy strengthens the system that created it. Nothing is wasted, nothing is meaningless, nothing fails to contribute to the greater glory of the machine. Do not forget that the Imperium's greatest achievement is not the conquest of the galaxy. It is the transformation of human compassion into a processing error. human dignity into a resource allocation problem, and human life into a number that always balances no matter how many people die to balance it. Do not think that your worst day compares to their average one. Do not imagine that the machine serves humanity when humanity exists only to serve the machine. The machine grinds on, and the next shift begins in 6 hours. The evacuation protocols are updated and filed. The casualty reports are processed and archived. The efficiency metrics are calculated and distributed to the appropriate authorities for review and implementation. And somewhere in the administrative depths of the Imperium, a clerk stamps another form with another approval for another evacuation that will process another million souls through another system designed to convert human life into bureaucratic success. The machine is perfect. The machine is eternal. The machine is all there is and all there needs to be, and all there will ever be until the galaxy burns down and the stars go out and the last human heartbeat fades into the silence between worlds. But that will not happen today. Today, the machine works. Tomorrow, the machine will work better. This is efficiency. This is progress. This is the price of serving something greater than yourself, even when that something has forgotten why greatness ever mattered in the first place.